There we go. And we're going to open up Blender. And this is where I left off really the other day, right? Wow, this is working really well. Hopefully it stays this way. So there we go. Now, in this case, I don't really want the stencil anymore, right? So remember, one of the things you could do is go to the texture menu here, and the X, right? Because remember, I kind of loaded this texture in, right? So we can go to X, and that kind of just turns it off. Okay, so everything's cool though? All right. All right. So you can also change to viewplane, right? All right, give me a second. Hello? I actually already sent her to the office. So she should be there? Because, yeah, they called me up before class started to have me send her over and a couple of students. Okay, bye. All right, back. All right. The fun of teaching in a high school and recording a video. All right. So at this point, basically, right, we have our texturing. We've already started up. But remember, you can go back to texture here, and you could either switch your mapping to viewplane. That's kind of a better one to have by default, usually for me. Even if you're not using texturing, it's kind of a good one to have on by default. That way, it's not trying to use these stencil quick keys. But remember, also, you can load your texture here. Once you've loaded it in, right, usually you have to go to here and then load one in. And this is something like bPainter. If you end up deciding to spend a little money on it, really kind of makes that whole process amazing. That's kind of one of those areas Blender's stock is, the actual painting tools are pretty good, but, like they still need a proper kind of like image browser layer system. And Asset Browser 3.0 should kind of, I think, remedy some of that stuff. But if you want to turn the texture off, remember, just go back to the texture menu here and just click on that X, and it just kind of gets rid of it, right? So that's kind of always good to do. Just want to double check that we're recording. Yeah, we are good. Thought we were. All right. So kind of just remember to turn that stuff off. At this point, right, this is going to kind of be a lighter lecture, but I did want to start to get the texturing for the gear going, right? We've kind of done some good stuff here. You could, of course, always go add some more, but something like this, right? This is your first character texturing, so you don't have to go nuts, right? But we do want some like good color variation here. Take advantage of the fact that you can paint at the pixel level, right? So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to crab gear, right? And I'm going to turn the eyeball on for it over here. Now, in this case, I'm going to turn off the crab body eyeball. Make sure to go to object mode 4. That way, and sometimes I just click on it again just to make sure you get that orange outline, right? So remember, you can turn the eyeballs off for this stuff. You can, of course, select them here, but sometimes you just want to double check to click it there so it's like fully activated. And now what we want to do is we want to create a new material and texture for that. Now, if I click on the reddish ball down here at the bottom, right? Remember, there's that reddish ball. When you're loading a texture into Paint with, you want to do it through the kind of red checkerboard at the very bottom here. But that red ball, right, that's kind of our ability to go in and look at our textures. Now, the nice thing is we've already done like some of our base color texturing before, right? And we want to plug a base color in, right? So we already kind of created the materials in an earlier one. You can always do it through here, but remember, you can always go to shading, right, and kind of, create a new material there, give it a name. And that's kind of stuff we've already done in a previous video, right? That's kind of already stuff we've done in a previous video. So back to texture paint. You can even plug your color maps into that shading system there. And we saw that kind of with plugging our normal maps in. But if it's just like some color map stuff, it's pretty easy to do kind of right through the texture painting view workspace, right? Go to the red ball. And remember, base color. Now, we already saw this, right, on the for the body. But we even saw this when we did our UV grid distortion, right? So remember, we've kind of already done and had a couple of videos, even before we started texture painting, where we kind of talked about some basics of materials with that reddish ball, right? Base color is your main color, right? So you can either pick a color if you want the whole thing to be a solid color, but you can also, of course, click on the yellow dot, and that brings up this, right? Amazingly enough, the TV's working great today. And we can go to what's called image texture, right? We can go to image texture right there. And when we do that, all of a sudden, usually it kind of temporarily goes black, but that's because it's kind of empty, right? Even though we've plugged the image texture node in here, we haven't actually loaded a texture into it. So basically, right now, it's kind of like an empty packet of information and code that's waiting to have an actual texture created for it. And now you see you can either open, if you already have an existing one you want to put on here, or if you want to make a new one, which is what we want to do. So I click on New. And remember, this is just like it was when we did the UV grid stuff, right? So we've actually now seen this like 3 times previous. Now in this case, I want to specifically name it, so I'm going to call it crab gear color. And I also want the pixel width to be higher. We'll do 2048. Obviously, if you've got a much nicer computer, you can go 4096 if you want to. I'm trying to keep this doable on your devices, right? So 2048 is probably going to be a better one for us. And since we have overlapping UVs, it's going to be 2048 on one half and then 2048 on the other half. It's the same texture. So you're kind of effectively getting a 4096, but only have to worry about the size of a 2048. Blank is what we want, right? Remember, you could do a generated type for UV grid, but we want blank because we're actually making a specific color texture we want to paint. And of course, I can go to color here and click on the color. Right, remember, there's that long bar that's the actual color. Usually by default, it's white. Sometimes you'll see it black. You can click on it, and it brings this up. Now, this is where you can normally pick your main color itself, but this over here controls the lightness. And I know we've talked about this before, but part of teaching is reteaching, is practicing with it, right? So remember, if you drag this slider up, all of a sudden you'll see it goes from black, and you see all of the colors again, right? So this is kind of your slider for the overall kind of value, right? The lightness, if you will. And so there we go. Now we've got more options for colors. And we wanted the body green, but I think this is going to be more of a leather, we'll kind of go with a brownish color, right? Go with kind of more of a brown. We'll hit OK. And now we have an actual texture plugged into there, right? Now, one of the things to remember is I'm going to kind of go over here. Remember, you can grab the little bar. Remember, you can always adjust the window sizes, right? I generally, when I'm doing a lot of my painting, unless I'm doing 2D painting here, we'll see that more on our next project, right? This one, we're not going to worry about that. Still got more to show you on our more advanced project. But you can always kind of minimize or maximize whichever workspace you want to kind of make the focus, right? I'm going to open this up a little more because you'll see right now the texture that's loaded in here is, and you're not really kind of quite seeing the texture here. So if you go back to like the white screwdriver wrench to see your properties for your brushes, you're not really seeing the texture in here yet. So sometimes I find I need to go up here, right? So just kind of open this, like I said, open this panel up a little bit more. And just go up to this little browser, right? Whenever you see kind of what looks like a triangle and like a little blue dot, almost like a landscape, like a super abstract landscape, like, oh, look, a mountain, it's a triangle. And then like the sun, it's a circle, right? You'll see this in a couple of different places. You click on that, that's your ability to browse for an image. And you'll see that the crab gear color is available in there. Once you have that in there, we can then go to image, save as, right? So like once that's kind of the active image in here, there is an image menu right there, right? We've seen this before. So this is just kind of more, like mostly what I'm going to be doing on this for the next day or two is the same stuff. I am going to show you guys how to make a roughness map for some metal on the rivets. That's about the only new thing. It'll just be the same stuff I showed on the previous videos. And we can go to save as, so image, save as. And in this case, it's already set up to be crab gear color. So I'll just save image as. And now you'll see that the actual crab gear color is truly available here. You can actually switch between what you want to modify, right? And we'll see this more probably tomorrow because I'm just going to focus on some color painting today, maybe a little more tomorrow. The roughness map won't take long to do. So we'll get the color map painting started here, and then we'll kind of finish it next class session and do a little bit of metal paint, basically. But now you'll see once you've kind of made sure that this is the active image here, and you've gone to image save as to make sure to give it the name you want, you will actually see it available here now to more easily browse for whatever your active layer is going to be. In this case, I usually kind of move this down a little bit, right? Move it down so you can still see image up here for saving as you go. But also remember, I've got file, external, automatically pack into Blender file turned on, right? So it's checked on. Remember, that makes it so that when you save your Blender file, it will save the textures in the Blender file. Having said that, as you paint, you will still have to go to image and save, right? To actually save any updates to the texture you've made. There is a quick key for that, Alt-S, right? Alt-S. So just a little bit about setting that stuff up again. It's a great thing to see again, right? It's going to be in our videos, of course. And I'll start to do some review stuff later this week with it as well. So now we've got that set up. And I'm actually even going to save my scene. There we go. So that image is even saved in it. And now, of course, we could paint again. Now, some of the cool things we saw were our ability to actually fill, right? Remember, we have a fill bucket right here, right? And so one of the things we could easily do is, click on Fill Bucket. Make sure that the white screwdriver, white wrench at the very top of our Properties menu here is on, right? Because there's a couple of them. The very top one, basically it's a white screwdriver and a white wrench. Click on that, and that shows you, like I said, your active textures you can paint with, but also just shows you some of your main options, including color for your brush. Of course, a lot of this stuff is up here as well, right? So you see a lot of this stuff up here as well. If you want to click there, you can go there. In this case, I'm going to pick kind of a lighter brown, like more of a yellowish brown than this kind of reddish brown. So you can pick a color for your fill bucket. Now in this case, though, I want to use the fill bucket on specific polygons. Remember how I kind of showed you this a bit on our crab creature body? So if I go to 3 for face mode, I can easily go in here and select what I want to fill. Now, what's interesting, of course, is we have a couple of ways to get that selection. If I go to 2 for edge mode, I could double left click on this edge loop, right? Double left click selects edge loops, and it selects that edge loop there. I can then also just shift double left click on this edge loop right here, right? And you can kind of see those were already our seams for our UVs. And by doing that, if I go to the select menu, you'll see in select loops there is select loop inner region. Now you'll notice in this video that there's a Z quick key for that. That's because I assigned that, right? If you don't see it, don't freak out. I assigned that shortcut, right? Remember, right click. In this case, change shortcut's available, but you would see assign shortcut, and then you can put whatever shortcut you want in there. So remember, that's just select loops, select loop inner region. And you notice how it selects just the polygons in between those 2 edge loops I selected. This is a neat tool, right? It basically looks at your edge loops selected, sometimes multiple, sometimes just one, and it finds the side that has less polygons. So whichever ones have less, that's what it's going to prioritize or bias to. So that's one way to grab all of those. Now, another way, since we already have seams here, is, believe it or not, if you just select a polygon on this shell, because remember, these seams indicate islands, so this whole part's an island. If I just go to select linked, that'll do the same thing because of the island. So your select linked actually works on islands in your UV space, right? In your UV space. Double check that it's still recording. Good. All right. And of course, if we go to 8, right? Remember, 8 is the quick key for texture paint. Although, if you go up to edit mode up here, right, just like we've seen it in our normal modeling workspace, right up here, there's edit mode. You click on that, and it's got all your modes. Texture paint is one of them. 8 is the quick key for that. 8 is the quick key for that. Now, we're back in texture paint mode. And you'll notice that, remember, right next to this texture paint mode is what looks like basically a polygon, right? It looks like a white square. And then there's view. If I click on that white square, you'll notice that it grays out the polygons that weren't selected. So you notice when I go back to 3, those faces are still selected. When I hit 8, that's on still, and it's only making editable those polygons that were selected. So this is our what it's called paint mask. And you could use paint mask with polygons. It's actually super, super cool. And with fill bucket on, with that color, I can just click in here, and now it fills just those polygons. If I turn this off, you'll now see there's the update. That's really, really cool. You'll notice that image now has a little asterisk next to it. It's kind of a little star thing you'll see on phones and all that stuff. Click on that, and of course, save. And now that's been updated. But remember, that button right there is your paint mask. And it will base it on your polygons that are selected. So if there's ever an area that you just want to paint on and not have it paint anywhere else, or you want to use your fill bucket on, that's it. And it's really cool. I actually love this feature in Blender. So that's a neat feature that Blender has that's quite cool, right? So remember, this is one of those things that we could do as we paint in Blender. We could just do those things, right? Now, of course, I can go back to my draw brush, the regular paint brush. It's kind of the top of these, right? The one that looks like an actual paint bucket with like a drop coming out of it, that's your fill, right? That's your fill. The very top one is draw. That's your normal paint brush, right? So now we can kind of go back up to there. I really feel like I want to do some image painting here. So I'm going to go to color, and I'm just going to make this kind of maybe a slightly kind of reddish brown. There we go. Maybe tone it down a little bit. Also, I probably want the strength of this brush to be a little lower, right? We don't want it super, super intense. But remember, we can go to texture, and we could load textures in. Now, if I wanted to load another one in here, I can, right? Remember, it's this red checkerboard at the very bottom here, right? We click on that. We can hit New. We can go to Open, right? It brings this up, and we hit New. In this case, we want to open, right? So I'm going to open. And then you can go find where you've downloaded your textures, right? You can see how you can go to desktop. If you've used recent folders here, you can add bookmarks. There's actually some really, really neat things this browser can do in Blender. And I just have kind of my textures here. Those are kind of interesting, but I also have stencils. So I've got a couple downloaded here. At home, I've got a vastly bigger one. I think I'm going to use this leather one, right? Open image. And now this is available to use, right? So remember that bottom red checkerboard, you click on that, and usually this will be blank with like a new. You click on that, and then it's kind of got that new versus open. In this case, since I want to open something to use as a texture to paint with, I go to open, right? Otherwise, you're going into the material, plugging it into a specific channel, and then you do new, and then you're actually making one from scratch. But that kind of little red checkerboard at the bottom is kind of a good way to load existing textures in. Now if I go up to texture here, you'll notice it's plugged in here. So once you do that, it'll be plugged in here. If you want to remove it, hit X. The thing, though, is it doesn't remove it from the Blender scene. It just makes it not active currently. So you'll see there's kind of this little white checkerboard here, right? If I click on that, you'll see there's now both of them in there. So the cool thing is, as you load these textures in, all of them will be available to browse with and use. So you don't have to keep reloading it in for the specific Blender scene. It'll kind of save with that Blender scene. So I'm going to click on that new one. Now, this time I don't want to use stencil, right? That's what I kind of showed you the other day. Right now I'm just going to use viewplane. And remember what viewplane does, and I'll just kind of show it off here again a little bit. It's best seen with stroke. Now, in this case, we want stroke method space. That's kind of the normal paint method, right? The spacing itself, though, that's how much space it's going to be before it drops this, right? So what happens is, with the low spacing, it paints, and it keeps painting that, right? It's like it stamps it. It says, okay, I'm going to put this image here, and then right almost on top of it, I'm going to put it again, almost top of it, I'm going to put it again, almost top of it, I'm going to put it again. As you turn stamp spacing up to, like, say, 70%, you could better see exactly what's going on with this. So if I start to paint, you see how it's kind of dropping it, and then dropping it a little ways off, and then dropping it a little ways off, and then dropping it a little ways off. So that's how you control that space between the stamping of it, right? So if I went to say like 130% spacing, you'll see even more clearly. Look at that gap. So you can see as I just move my brush, what it does, it drops that, right? It places it, places it, places it. So it's taking that image each time and placing it as kind of a faded circle, placing it as a faded circle, placing it as a faded circle. And that spacing is what's giving it so much space. So if you want more space, just turn your spacing up. In this case, I actually wanted it low because I just wanted it to be this general kind of noisy texture. And you see how it's kind of almost on top of each other, but it's still painting it. You can kind of see that bit of noise in there. It's easier to see on my monitor than on that TV unless you get closer. And this could just be a general way. If you're not looking for a super specific kind of texture effect, this could be a great way to get certain things. If you're just looking for like a more generalized kind of simple noise using an image, I find that this one works pretty well. Stencil is the whole image comes up and you paint exactly the image. You can paint parts of it, and also we'll see that again another day, probably our next session for this stuff up here. But I figured it'd be great to just kind of point out that, of course, right, and I'm going to turn the symmetry off of this, right? You can get some weird artifacting when you have UVs on top of each other if the symmetry is on for painting. Because our UVs are on top of each other. And I just paint. So remember, you don't have to use a stencil to paint an image, but they will give you distinct differences, right? This is just painting on top, on top, on top, on top. Stencil, the whole image comes up, and you paint exactly the whole image exactly as it is, whereas this is kind of like small image, small image, small image, small image, and they just kind of overlap top of each other. So like I said, that's kind of better if you're looking for just kind of a more straightforward, quick kind of image noise texture. But we see this could be a great way to kind of lay down just a little bit of kind of a bit of a simplistic kind of leather noise effect. It really depends on what kind of effect you're going for. But I'm just trying to get you guys to remember that texture here, you can load textures in, and that mapping, either viewplane or stencil, could do some really cool stuff, right? These other ones do some interesting things, but I find that the most everyday useful are viewplane and stencil. So in this case, we're just using viewplane for that. It's a great way to just kind of get some cool texturing on that model. And then, of course, when I'm happy, I can just go back to texture here, click on X, so it's no longer on. We don't want to keep painting with that texture, right? And then if I wanted to, remember, we can actually kind of use our brush, right? Draw brush is already on. Remember, radius is right here, although your left and right brackets can make that brush bigger or smaller. And S, right? If you click S and drag left or right, it'll make your brush size bigger or smaller also. So I could easily then go to, say, mix here, right? And pick something like multiply. Remember, you have blend modes on your brushes. And so with a lower strength here, I can just kind of darken this area up a little bit. I probably should set the color darker too. Usually you want your color mid-range, so it's either more pronounced or more subtle. And you see I can kind of go in here and I could just grime out a little bit, darken kind of those cracks and crevices. Oftentimes an ambient occlusion, if you bake it from a sculpt, can do this. But I kind of like to have a bit more of a stylized effect for it. And it's just a great way for me to show you that you can actually use these blend modes to, you know, kind of create some grimes or cracks in a crevice or play with the shading a little bit for your model. Of course, if I wanted to, I could use the line stroke for this, right? So if I go to stroke and I click on space, I can go to line, and you will notice that all of those strokes that we saw in sculpting work for this, right? So believe it or not, all of the strokes that we used for sculpting apply to painting. So a lot of what we did, right, for our sculpting still applies to this. Like I said, sculpting and painting are kind of cousins. They're far from identical, obviously, but a lot of the same brush features, right, can be used on all of them. You could paint with viewplane and stencil and images, as well as use all the stroke types, whether it's sculpting or painting. So a lot of that stuff you were learning about on sculpting still applies here, and it's just applying to color instead of sculpting. So remember, all these functions are available to you. And even line stroke works for this. And you see how you can just get in here and do some pretty neat stuff with this? Like I said, stock Blender, it needs a better image loading browsing for the textures you're going to use system. It needs a better kind of layer system. bPainter offers that, and it's quite good. It's not free, though. It is like a $40 add-on. Very much worth it if you're seriously want your texture painting in Blender to be better. Oh, now that's starting. Oh, there we go. Now disconnected. Okay, well, I finished that video up anyways, so yeah. I'll stop recording. That'd be a great place to stop.